difficult circumstances that now massively harm them in the status quo. First of all, we believe the art we should be subsidizing is art that is picturing being part of the working class to be a generally positive thing, right? So just like picturing it positive to be part of the working class also pictures the working class to be a coherent unit, so to say, like, that not only specific industries have specific identities, but to picture the working class across multiple industries, multiple companies, multiple different jobs to be one coherent unit. It also probably pictures the working class and their struggles in human history as positive. For example, like their work during the periods of industrialization, for example, their periods in uprisings against unfair working conditions in early industrialization. All of those things where the working class acts as a coherent unit, always pictured positively, are that falls under this notion, are that we will subsidize. The working class that we describe here are generally people who work for industries or companies who fulfill two very important criteria. First of all, they don't have control over their own means of production. It means they don't control shares in their company, they have not ownership over their company, they're not a partner or anything. They don't control any kind of means of production themselves. Their subsistence is only based on them being paid by their company. They only own their own working capital. B, they don't have any leading positions themselves, so they don't control other workers that work for them in a meaningful way. Just those are the two criteria that probably define working class in this version. We believe that in the developed world, this is probably mainly like basic service industries, but we also believe there are still a lot of manufacturing jobs this applies to. But in the developing world, we also do have quite a lot of manufacturing jobs that also fall in this category. So how do we subsidize this? Generally, similarly to how art is usually subsidized. Nations often have subsidization programs for specific arts. For instance, the NEA in the USA. Those should then prioritize the works of art in distribution of funding. For example, they should specifically give funding to those artists that are very likely to create those kinds of works of art. Those should probably give subsidization to specific pieces of art and do commercial with them and increase their reach if those pieces of art fulfill our specific criteria. We believe this applies everywhere in the world, even if not every single country has an art endowment program. We still believe that making art more visible, making increasing the proliferation of art, and making just more art being made to be possible, this will probably extend in the entire world. This not only applies to higher art, this also obviously applies to things like works of music. This also applies to things like TV shows. This also applies to books. This applies to every kind of art that massively talks about this. So we believe that this not only changes the weighing, and is principally good because that's what I'm going to talk about later, but also specifically necessary because art is often made from one's own perspective, right? So those that are most likely to make art about the specific working class are probably people that have experienced those working class struggles themselves, right? There is often a lot of personal experience needed and present for people to create works of art that concern, for example, the working class. We believe that the working class in the States go structurally disadvantaged from creating those specific works of art because the working class has a specific little ability to create art themselves without subsidization. Crucially, the working class is most often defined by working long hours every day, not having specifically a lot of time to create art, but also by just not having the financial resources to risk going into art, just pumping a lot of resources and hours into it if it may not pay off in a significant way. So we believe that the working class is already structurally disadvantaged in having art created that glorifies them compared to art that glorifies literally every other group. We believe that this just allows less happiness that is generated from art, right? Like seeing your own identity being present in art, seeing what you consider as your kind to be present in art is a generally positive experience. If you as a working class man or woman don't experience yourself as being portrayed positively in a lot of ways, this probably just harms you because you don't see yourself being pictured as positively as this. Okay.
So there's a huge corpus of proletariat literature as well as art that depicts the working class, even without this kind of funding. Why is this particularly necessary in doing so?
Well, there might be some of this. We believe that more of this would be better. We also give you structural reasons why there is not a lot of it to begin with, because there are structural barriers for this not to happen as often. So even if there is a huge corpus of that, this corpus could be proliferated more because it generally has positive impacts. First of all, the main impact will be derived from this constructing group identity in a meaningful way. We believe that art in general influences the perception of people and the perception specifically of what groups they belong to and the perception of what struggles they take part in. This leads to subsidizing this art and having this art be proliferated in a meaningful way leads to workers seeing themselves as being a part of the group working class as opposed to only, for example, a group of people working in the service industry or working in one specific field, one specific company, because we believe this art will be very good at demonstrating the struggle that all of the working class has, that specific workers are in the status quo only associated with themselves. For example, like the general struggle of working for capital that you consider unjust, just the daily struggle and long hours of work. All of this are things that this art can picture and that every member of the working class can find themselves in, as to make them realize that they are part of a bigger class than just their specific company, their specific service and circumstance. It also, we believe this also makes it be considered less shameful that, to be part of the working class, because there's a very strong stigma against the working class in broad parts of the population and communities right now. If you depict it positively in a meaningful way, people will not try to find a cop-out of being part of the working class, for example, like saying, my specific industry is not really working class because, but will consider themselves specifically part of the working class more, because there will be less of a stigma associated with it if this art is more popular and shapes perception in a meaningful way. We believe this has like 4 impacts on how the working class is actually able to deal with problems it currently has. Like, crucially, there is very little capital that specific companies, specific industries have in negotiating their own conditions. Because those are often very small subgroups that A, don't have a lot of power in their own companies, and B, don't really have a lot of power in democratic societies to achieve policies for them, because the specific groups are very small. If the working class themselves classify themselves as one big class, they can it is way more plausible that they can push for policies together, that they can push for change together. This can, for example, take place in specific unions, but also just in political parties that represent people in the working class and say, we are working for the working class. We believe that those parties then can specifically, like, A, this makes strikes more effective, which is a means of the working class to work against unfair conditions, because you can just, if everybody goes on strike that considers themselves to be part of the working class because of one specific violation, this is far more likely to be effective. Also, policy push that only concerns certain industries, for example, like dealing with toxic waste, or having safety measures for, I don't know, just not dying in construction because things fall on your head. All of those things are way more likely to be pushed if the entire working class rallies behind singular pieces of policy that help specific parts of the working class, because they still consider themselves part of the similar struggle. This also applies to 2 very important fields. First of all, workers' rights, which I've already dealt with. The second of all, automatization, which is a massive danger that is coming towards society that specifically concerns the working class, because their job will be the ones that will be replaced first. If the working class can rally behind installing policies to weaken this and to get to a universal income state or something, this is also massively beneficial. For all of those reasons, part of the proposal.
Yeah, we thank the speaker very much, and would like to invite the leader of opposition to open the opposition case.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about basically 3 things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about why this does not empower working class citizens in 2 ways. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about why it creates government-friendly sort of narrative that exploits individuals rather than protecting individuals. And secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why it significantly reduces the quality of art that already exists and why that's bad. And secondly, I'm going to advance the point about why alternative or the proletariat arts that already exist can be a sort of like counter-narrative or counter-mechanism to what they propose under their side of the house. Lots of engagements will be actually directly dealt with in my point because it directly crashes with the PM point. But the thing is, I have some rebuttals to their side of the house. So the main point was about creating group identity. But the thing is that we think that if they want to characterize the suffering of individuals, they should not depict it as positive, because what they are doing is that, for example, the people who are before the industrial period and so forth, those people are pretty much exploited, and we think that they, to the extent that they are depicting the working class positively, they rather lose that capital for them to stand up and say this environment is wrong. We think the false sense of unity is rather harmful. And then they talked about the problem is the danger and nuclear waste and so forth. We're more than happy to act specifically on that issue, because those issues are not dependent on working class citizens consuming art, but working class citizens looking at the imminent danger in there and creating the political capital to vote in order to make that situation better. If they have money to subsidize art, subsidize healthcare, subsidize all of the minimum wage and paid leave, those things are far more direct change we'd like to advance on the side opposition. We just don't understand what they want to do. So firstly, let's talk about why this creates perverse incentive, because governments are likely to manipulate this kind of narrative. So we think we have to characterize what this art actually looks like, right? For example, working class citizens, for example, Little Girl, for instance, they're working very hard and creating some sort of unity. It's sort of pro-government sort of narrative, right? Because the government, like Russia, like China, who is more likely to create these narratives because they want to structurally exploit these citizens, are likely to subsidize art, picking and choose art, which favors the government narrative, meaning the fact that this is likely to be, for example, people, despite their exploitation, uniting together and having fulfillment in daily lives and stuff like that. These are the types of depiction that are far likely under their side of the house. And even if that is not the case, even if government itself is really not perverse and not coercive, artists themselves have a perverse incentive, because they recognize that their income and their subsidization is contingent upon the government's perspective, right? That means that they're more likely to create narratives that favors the government's narrative, which is exploiting citizens at cheap cost and cheap labor on cheap wage. We think that's extremely harmful. Why is it harmful, right? Because firstly, when the government is able to manipulate these individuals by it causes further exploitation, right? How does it happen? Because it creates within these working class citizens false sense of unity and false sense of fulfillment, because what they consume is the narrative that those people are already glorified, those people are fulfilled, those people have unity inside and don't have to stand up against all the oppressions that they're going to stand for, right? And the thing is that this is more likely because on their side of the house, especially Prime Minister already told you this is going to be depicted as positive. We think that's extremely problematic. Why is that so? Even if, for example, death because of overworking actually happens, people lose that capital to accuse it, people lose that capital to empathize with it, because they have a false sense of narrative, a false sense of unity that says you're already kind of fulfilled in the society, you have friends, you have colleagues, you have all the unity inside. We think that's enough. And also notice that if you have this sort of sense of false sense of unity and false sense of fulfillment, you have decreased capital to actually care about the oppression of other individuals, oppression on you, because it tells you that you are good, it tells you that you should be glorified in the society. We think it's far more disempowering to these individuals. On our side of the house, on the comparative, we think we have a natural incentive to fight against that kind of exploitation, especially when their problem is about safety standards and so forth. We think the incentive of those individuals are more likely to exist. And the thing is that in modern society, we don't see working class citizens being so much oppressed. We have already, in vast majority of cases, vast majority of countries, we already have labor unions, and labor unions, every single year, have annual sort of concession, annual discussion with their employers. We think those mechanisms do exist in very many parts of the world. We think this just creates perverse incentive that's bad. So secondly, let's talk about why this is counterproductive in terms of creating art that they are worried about, right? Because firstly, the quality of art regarding these working class citizens are going to be substantially decreasing under their side. Firstly, because artists are going to be, to a certain extent, lazy, right? Artists, the main purpose of artists, main incentive of artists is to be creative, to have competition within museums and so forth. That's exactly what happened in Dutch, for instance, when Dutch government tried to subsidize artists several years ago. And the thing is that all the artists knew that the government is funding these people to a certain extent, and and they were less motivated to create art. That's why annually, every single 10 years, Dutch is creating a really beautiful artist in the world, but specifically on that period of time, that artist did not actually come out from Dutch, right? We think that's extremely harmful. And also notice that when that art is everywhere, everyone is going to be desensitized from that art, because that kind of art depiction is everywhere. We think it decreases the people's reaction towards it, because what is art? Well, the crucial point of art is it's becoming inspiring. That is going to be decreased under their side of the house. But on our side of the house, we think we already have these kind of arts already, right? For example, Millet depicting wheat pickers, for instance, because they're more likely to fulfill the demand from these working class citizens that is still there. They have much more incentive to try to work on it, and also oftentimes these people are inspired by the attitudes of working class citizens making efforts on a daily basis, and that's exactly why they are more likely to create good art on our side of the house that is actually inspiring to these individuals, right? We think on our side of the house, to the extent that they compromise that, we think we create better kind of art that is actually empowering these individuals in the sense that these people are not desensitized, these people can actually have the capital to care about it. For all these reasons, we oppose this motion.
Okay, we thank the speaker very much, and I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case in the government.
Crucially in this debate, glorifying the struggles of working class people doesn't glorify the circumstances of their exploitation, it glorifies their struggle against them. So AFA glorifies working class people, it also glorify things like coordinated strikes across industries to improve the working conditions for some subpart of the industry with massive solidarity from other parts. The big problem the working class in their struggle faces today is fractured identities and the ability of capital and of governments to pit them against each other. This is exemplified in struggles for things like minimum wage, where people who are slightly above minimum wage are told that everything for them is going to get much more expensive and that they should oppose minimum wage, even though they would profit from the ability of governments to implement redistributive measures or measures for things like minimum wage and minimum job security themselves, if they started the struggle themselves. This narrative counterbalances this ability to pit them against each other. A few points of extraneous rebuttal. Firstly, they tell us this glorifies the circumstances of exploitation. We tell you the exploitation is going to be much more likely in a scenario where less people identify with the injustice of particular pieces of exploitation. So different parts of the working class are exploited in different ways. Unless they struggle together, they are less likely to get things like working safety standards in one industry and mandatory leave in others. Secondly, they tell us, but this costs money, we could use this to just redistribute and so on. Firstly, subsidizing art is comparatively cheap in comparison to things like healthcare. Secondly, this is likely just going to reallocate art subsidizing money from other areas, from stop subsidizing art that glorifies specific histories or something. We don't think this debate should be massively about money because art budgets are kind of fixed. Okay, then they get into their constructive, which is firstly, this is going to be government-friendly narratives. First response to that, even if the government controls this form of art, this is still a unique, glorified, a common identity for the working class people that makes it more likely that they struggle together against capital. Noticeably, the capital and the owners of the means of production are the more important enemy of the working class here than governments are, and struggling against them for things like better working conditions is the most important thing. Secondly, they give us, this gives a false sense of fulfillment. We don't glorify the circumstance, so we make cross-struggle more likely. I've gotten into that, Anton explained this quite brilliantly. Secondly, they tell us, this reduces quality of art. first response to that, like the artists that produce art in the status quo are likely to still produce the same amount of art in the status post. It's just additional artists that get funding for specifically working class art. It is unclear why they would produce worse art. The third part they give us is about desensitizing things. Desensitizing people to this form of art. Firstly, this is uncomparative, so maybe over time when people develop a common identity, then they are less likely to develop much more of that common identity, but as soon as we reach the first part of solidarity, this is fine. What we give you in opening government, and why you should specifically care about that, is three things. Firstly, access to art as an identity form by a group that historically struggles for an identity and keeps struggling as capital has massive incentives to fracture their forms of identities in the status quo. Secondly, working class stigma is currently crowded out, is currently produced by other narratives. For example, the narrative that glorifies higher education and access to that as opposed to other things, and that stigmatizes working class people as stupid and uneducated, which has massive harms for them and their political capital. And thirdly, the ability of a common identity to produce political bargain. Why should you specifically care about this? First, the working class is uniquely excluded from the path of recognition that other classes have. Why is this? Firstly, the glorification of the life models of other classes are much more prevalent in the status quo and in public discourse. Secondly, narratives like the American dream de-glorify or vilify the working class as like a necessary step to a higher life form, which is owning and starting your own business, which also makes them feel like they are unsuccessful in their own life because they haven't made it, which makes it less likely that they feel fulfilled. Secondly, the working class is also uniquely excluded from access to art. Why is that? Firstly, they have less disposable income and less disposable time to spend into art and to the barriers of entry that currently exist for art. Secondly, these barriers of entry. So, for example, the education that you need to understand a play by Shakespeare or specific forms of paintings also keep them from enjoying art in the ways that we described. Thirdly, though, also the incentives within art that result from that make it less likely that art for working class people is produced in the first place. The response we get to this analysis from opening opposition is in their POI, where they say there's already a huge body of proletariat literature. Two responses to that. Firstly, most of this literature is outdated, so the working class struggles change every year and every decade, and it needs constant updating of art to still capture that struggle and still create an identity. Obviously, people who work in the service industry nowadays don't identify with the working class struggle of like the 1900s or the 1950s, but they identify with current forms of identification and current forms of art. Closing, I'll take you if you have anything.
No.
That is not the case. Okay, secondly, there's uniquely fractured identities now. So it's not the feeling of a common working class has been lost in most countries, in as much as people identify as part of their particular industry, and thus are unlikely to struggle in favor of trade-offs that would be made in favor of other working class people. Third thing we give you, and this is very unique from opening government, this is probably the last or second to last generation that can actually achieve the forms of changes that people who are currently working class need. Automation is a massive threat to equality of access to many things. Most governments are uniquely bad at installing the redistributing systems that would be needed in order to achieve a long-lasting equality in the face of further control of the means of production in the hands of very few rich people. In the status quo, having a working class identity and having the ability to do things like mass strikes makes it more likely that they can have massive income security in the future when their jobs are going to be replaced by machines. It is unlikely that we get these forms of redistribution without mass struggle today, as long as the working class still has the necessary political capital in order to fight back. This is connected to a gradual loss of bargaining power in the future, so we also need to do this now. The working class needs a common identity to first feel good about their current lifestyle, and secondly, to achieve struggle and political change in favor of them. Very happy to propose.
Let's invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the first half of this debate.
they get more good art. But I think that the premise that they haven't fulfilled is why this art that gets created by subsidization is particularly effective at creating a good common narrative for these working class people. We think that that assumption is something that they have never filled in. What we tell you obviously on opening opposition is that firstly, this art is likely to be held hostage by the government and it is unlikely to actually help with working rights. But secondly, even to the extent that this is not true, we think the kind of narrative that will be created as a result of this art, glorifying workers, is actually perverse for these workers and leads them to things like karoshi in Japan, where people like work themselves to death, and we think that that narrative is actually bad for them. We don't think that there's any response to that. After a couple of rebuttals, I'll give you the comparative. Why we think that the current models of funding that government does not enter are actually better in the status quo than when you have government funding, because it crowds out the kind of individual and corporate funding that is actually conducive to creating good and challenging art. Before that, a couple of rebuttals. Firstly, they said that the working class is excluded from the art and status quo. But we think that that's a matter of funding trips to museums or maybe making museums more accessible to the working class instead of, like funding art in the first place. I think that's a problem solution is not on their side of the house. But secondly, they said their problem is that working class people cannot currently create art. Well, we think firstly that that's not really true in the case that we have the kinds of sponsors that we talk about later. So if you create good art, you're still likely to be funded even under our side of the house. But secondly, we think that people who are not necessarily from working class upbringings also have an incentive to draw the working class in a way that is favorable for them. Especially because like the working class has a different kind of lifestyle than they possibly have. There's a source for inspiration for them. It is likely that the kind of lifestyles that working class people assume are actually very effective artistic materials even for the wealthy people, which is why there's still a lot of proletariat art and a lot of like art forms, not just literature, right? Everything like music, like paintings as well, that actually do depict the working class in a positive light. So we think that their problem of not enough art that is conducive to the working class is actually non-existent even in the status quo. So let's talk firstly about the comparative. Why do we think that the art that exists, that the art funding that exists in the status quo is sufficient to have this kind of art and actually better for creating the good kinds of art that we want to support these proletariat people in the status quo? We think that when in the status quo, funding is things, for example, like done by liberal millionaires like Silicon Valley. If we see like people like Michael Bloomberg, these people do want to fund the fine arts, and they also have an incentive to find art that actually benefits the working class because of their ideological upbringings and because of the way that they believe. So that's why there's still likely to be funding for these working class people art on their side, on our side of the house, right? But we think furthermore, it's also likely that we still have things like art connoisseurs. We have museums that want to fund like art that is challenging to the conception of art or like how art should be in the status quo, which means that there is an incentive to fund that kind of art that is not really conventional, right? So it's like art that does not necessarily depict the aristocratic people, but actually does depict challenging things like the working class people rising up, or like the working class people's everyday lives, like Millet and his picture of the wheat pickers, right? We think these kinds of art do exist in the status quo and are funded particularly by the people who want to see new forms of art and challenging forms of art existing within our world. This is why there's still funding even on our side of the house, and even if they maybe in closing government say that corporate funding might exist even under our side, we think there's good room for proletariat art that actually does glorify the workers under our side of the house, right? We think it's comparatively actually better because it's likely to be art that is depicting these people challenging these structures within society, that is likely to depict people like maybe rising up and having strikes even on our side. Before we go on closing, no? Okay. And so what is the problem under their side of the house? We think that this kind of funding is actually mutually exclusive. The reason being that if you have government funding, it's unlikely that artists are likely to seek out this kind of funding because they don't need it in the first place, because they know the government is going to fund them in the first place, but also because these artists, because they know whatever type of art they produce, but if it's likely to glorify the working class, then they're going to be funded by the government anyway, so they don't submit their pieces of artwork to things like competitions, like things like galleries that could actually lead them to having wider recognition by the international community and getting these kinds of funding under the status quo. But I think secondly, these donors, right, these liberal people as well as these art connoisseurs also don't feel they need to fund this kind of art under their side of the house because the government is funding it anyway, so why would they need this funding in the first place? So we think there's a trade-off between this government funding and this other type of funding. Why is government funding particularly bad? We think that Utaro's points in this regard went completely ignored in this case. We think that what happened was, if you as a government fund art, it's likely to create a perverse incentive on the part of these artists. So these artists are likely to create art that does not depict coordinated strikes because they're going to fear not getting funding by the government the next time, because the government doesn't want things, for example, that foment these strikes that could lead to government opposition, for example, in countries like China or Russia, but even to the extent that it's not even to the extent that it is liberal democratic states, we're still not going to fund these kinds of things because these artists are going to feel scared about this kind of incentive. So that's why this kind of challenging art that depicts the working working class unified in opposition to structures that oppose them are not going to be created under their side of the house, but it's likely more to be created on our side, which is why our side better benefits these workers under the status quo. But we think the best case scenario that they want to talk about is a creation of a narrative that unifies workers, that working is good, right? We don't think that that's created under their side of the house either. Before we go on, opening.
Isn't it infinitely more likely that a Silicon Valley billionaire who employs hundreds of people is going to fund the forms of art that make working class people complacent and create fractured identities?
No, because we think that there is likely that even if you have millionaires like that, there are going to be individuals that do fund these other types of art because they want this kind of challenging new art, because they want new forms of art to be developed under the status quo. But we think that under their side of the house, even if their norms depict workers like in union, gathering together, being very effective, we think that's actually bad for these workers, right? Because it usually creates a narrative that is not just workers that are good, but it's working that is good, right? So it's likely to be things depicting people working maybe 24/7, working very, very hard. We think that that creates a kind of narrative that is actually exclusive to people who do not want to suffer for work in the status quo. So you get art that creates. So you get people creating a narrative that not working hardest is bad. So not working until death is a bad thing. You need to work all the time, and you need to fulfill your duty as a working class member in order to fulfill that kind of narrative and the expectations that you have. We think that that is actually bad because you create a narrative that is opposite, that is actually harmful to people who do not want to work forever, who do not want to be exploited, and therefore who actually do want to challenge these structures that exist right now. Why do we actually get a better narrative under our side of the house? Because of the industry structures that we depicted to you, because on our side of the house we are more likely to have the kind of challenging art. Artists are likely to challenge norms. We think that these funders are actually likely to fund art that does challenge norms. Then it's more likely that we're going to have art that criticizes the kind of structures that exist right now, that it is more likely that we're going to have art depicting the struggles of working class people, and therefore people who do not have the best life right now. We think that on our side of the house we actually get a better depiction of that narrative, and we think that that is why it is more likely that our side of the house creates that kind of narrative. So ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, they never told us why more art is definitely good art, but we tell you that the kind of art that exists on our side of the house is better for creating the goals that they wanted to achieve. We're proud to oppose this motion.
All who subsidizes anything. So I don't think there was a better alternative at all coming from side opposition. But the unique thing that we said coming from government is that at the very least we are able to fund more, and at the very least it's a more democratic party, right? First and foremost, let's talk about the idea of they say that, oh, you're going to end up saying that, oh, there's going to be an interest in only the white faces of all these working classes to begin with. I don't think that's true at all. Because if the minority is oftentimes the majority of the working class, in order for you to get value from that art, or in order for you to make that art valuable, or be able to sell that art to begin with, or become an actually effective form of a policy at all, subsidizing these things and seeing your returns, you have to actually represent who exactly the working class is. And I don't think the government is going to be unstrategic in only trying to choose one specific part of the working class, especially if the point is to make it more accessible, or if the point is to sell it to most of the working class. I think there's a bigger incentive for the government or any party, for that matter, to actually represent them, and by making it more diverse. Secondly, the idea of the fact that even if they homogenize it, I think they're not going to homogenize it by saying that only white people are working class. They're obviously going to ground similarities, right? For example, the fact that you have to work 9 to 5, and these are the things that are unifying factors. And the fact of the matter is, that is the unifying factor, right? And I don't think there's a problem with that, because even if you have a white person in the front, at the very least a black person can say that I can relate to that because I know how hard you have to work for that. Because the alternative is that art is going to be concentrated to the upper classes of people, the people who earn a lot of money, the art connoisseurs that were apparently the other alternatives. We would rather live in a world in which the working class, no matter the face, has some form of unifying factor which we can actually empower these people with, right? But thirdly, right, why the government is better? Because at the end of the day, we think that they are more democratic in terms of subsidizing, right? We don't think the internet is enough, because at the very least, because you're going to make only videos, right? I don't think that's impactful enough for representation. Whenever you give more money and more subsidies, the government can, for example, give you materials, for example, draw, or to make more cultural forms of art. Like, for example, the South African government, right? Giving things for makeshift homes, where these people were able to innovate that and create more cultural arts in in showing what exactly the working class lifestyle actually looks like, right? We think that the government is the best party to do it. Secondly, let's talk about what exactly we mean, what exactly the working class problems are, and why primarily closing government were the ones that deal with it. Number one, we told you that they were in a state of oftentimes suffering, when they are undervalued, and this in turn means that they they were not empowered for a lot of things. The fact that they were underrepresented and there was a lack of representation. Where does this stem from? We told you number one, it's oftentimes the fact that not a lot of people want to talk about the working class. Oftentimes art is elitist and oftentimes like stems from and oftentimes it's concentrated or like it's more popular among the elite connoisseurs, which is apparently like opening opposition's other alternative in which they wanted like this art connoisseurs to fund and apparently make working class art more elitist. I don't think that's like logic, right? But like we think this is an issue. But secondly, it's also the fact that the working class exists and it's not likely that they're going to escape that lifestyle anytime soon, or it's not very easy for them to escape that lifestyle. And this is something you have to acknowledge. In a world in which under both sides we're not likely to make them climb the socioeconomic ladder and suddenly jump to the upper echelons of society, we think it's best for us to at the very least empower them and give them some form of solace within closing government brings you that, right? Now, what are we actually glorifying? We never told you the fact that, oh, we're going to glorify the oppression. Because no, the idea of oppression stems from the fact that we're unempowered to begin with. The fact that they were oppressed was the fact that the people, the capitalist structures that were exploiting them felt that they had the power over them, or that were the more superior people because they were underempowered. In a world in which you lack representation, you put them in a situation, the working class, in a situation in which they are unable to defend themselves, or feel that they do not deserve to defend themselves. At the end of the day, we think that is extremely problematic. What did CG do? But before that, sure.
So governments are particularly bad funders for the working class art because that challenges the status quo, because it doesn't want things like strikes or struggles or the working class rising up and challenging the kind of problems that you talked about.
Then number one, I don't think that's true, because oftentimes they're not necessarily against the government when it comes to strikes. In fact, if there are forms of you actually showing what the people want, I think it's always in favor of the government to give a voice to the most underrepresented people. But secondly, it's also the fact that oftentimes strikes are against capitalist structures, right? It's the fact that governments want to empower these people. And like thirdly, right, oftentimes art is the way in you to express how you feel prior to actually giving a lot of these strikes or creating a lot of these things. I think it's a way of you actually listening to people without having them go through all of that, right? What did we bring to you? Why was it extremely important? We brought you a few things. Number one, the fact that empowerment is extremely important, and specifically for the fact that it gives solace to a lot of these people. Because understanding these contexts of why we there was a lack of representation, etc., we think at this point is when you give like some sort of comfort in that lifestyle in a lot of these people. Because we think at the end of the day, what we tend to glorify is the efforts that they actually go through. And in the status quo, we think that not a lot of people, or not a lot of these working class people, feel that their efforts are being acknowledged. We think in that world is when you tend to like give them a lot of more, empower them a lot more. And we think that this leads to a few impacts, right? Number one, discussions regarding what exactly the working class is going through. And this is precisely how you change a lot of things and give them, and like see that they're actually human beings and like humanize a lot of their struggles to begin with. And this is extremely important. Why? Because this is precisely the route as to how you actually create more of a discussion revolving the working class, because the converse is a world in which your art is still going to be concentrated like among elitists, and oftentimes when you only allow private corporations, when you only allow individuals to fund a lot of these things, you allow the struggles of working class to only be concentrated in that area. In a world in which you allow some form of relatability towards a lot of these working class, is when oftentimes the working class is going to benefit more from these things, right? But secondly, right, we think it's extremely important for society, for it to be more accessible to a lot of these people, and this is precisely why we need governments to fund this, right? We told you in a world in which oftentimes it's harder for them to get a lot of funding, or like there's no one in favor of them in status quo. It's extremely important for governments to be the one to make it more accessible when it comes to utilities and all of these things. And plus, when government funds a lot of these things, a lot of these arts are going to be dispersed more easily. Instead of having in some elite museums, it's very likely that these arts are going to be more accessible. Therefore, it's easier for it to be like used by other working class people, or for other working class people to reap the benefits of this. And this is extremely important, right? Especially in a world in which minorities are the ones that concentrate the working class. There's an importance in you to empower these people, and we think we can only get them in a world in which you make it relatable, and only from government funding can you get that. Thank you.